There was a time before computers. Before computers, there was storytelling. Before there was television, there was storytelling. Welcome to Discovering Our Story. Here we share stories both timeless and contemporary. Stories kept by our elders and lived by our people. Stories that celebrate indigenous ways of knowing. Stories that provide illumination. Stories that celebrate native resilience. Stay with us. Discovering Our Story starts now.
Okay, I'm Joe Cantrell. I'm Cherokee from Oklahoma, a U.S. Navy veteran of Vietnam conflict. And the smallpox epidemics apparently were just horrible. So the population was severely decreased before many Cherokees ever saw a white man. It was traveled from village to village, and there was no immunity. So everybody got it, and it was pretty bad. This led to a series of conflicts with other tribes, our traditional enemies, Iroquois and Seneca, whoever, because our position was weakened, and depending on how things worked out, that created an imbalance of power that led to a lot of wars. The Cherokee culture was pretty advanced. Women held a predominant role in it, and they were pretty bright people as things went. They lived in settlements and were ruled by a kind of hierarchy that the chiefs rotated. In the War of 1812, we actually sided with the Americans, and at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, saved Andrew Jackson's life. This was somewhat ironic because he was then the president who ruled over the Cherokee removal. As more and more white settlers moved in, the Cherokee resisted. Actually, it was in the Red Stick War, which I believe was kind of an offshoot of the War of 1812, where the Cherokees saved Jackson's life. And the Cherokees had realized that they couldn't militarily overcome the force the Europeans carried. There were just too many of them, and their arms were too modern. And so they had tried to assimilate and had established schools and farms and dropped the hunter-gatherer sort of lifestyle, and had set up a printing press. And yet as the settlers moved in more and more, there were conflicts, and the Cherokees realized that they were going to have to go. The government in Washington was suggesting that they be removed to what's now Oklahoma, primarily the eastern and northern parts of Oklahoma. And some had gone out there to scout it out. In the late 1820s, I believe they started going. I have an ancestor, Joe Martin, whose name I carry obviously, who left Georgia with his wife and 5 kids in 1834 with Reverend Samuel Wooster, a Moravian missionary who had done a lot to defend the Cherokees. He was quite a guy. He'd been imprisoned because of his advocacy for the Cherokees and had been, lashed with a rod, and he was imprisoned at hard labor, but they let him out, and he and Joe Martin, my grandfather, several times removed, and others obviously, started to Oklahoma to see what was out there. I mean, this wasn't empty land. There were Kiowas and Caddos, and people lived there. Pawnees lived there. There was supposed to be a boat, a barge, to take them down the river. It didn't show up. Joe Martin, my grandfather, caught a disease. There was yellow fever and cholera and malaria. All these things we think of now as tropical diseases. They were endemic to the South U.S. at that time. He caught a disease and died. And so my grandmother and the 5 kids went back to Georgia, and they stayed there through the Cherokee removal. When she finally, after the Civil War, she and 8 children now finally got to Oklahoma. And as they did, they were carrying this rifle. This is a .36 caliber cap lock that would have been about the 1850s, 1860s vintage. It's got a .36 caliber barrel because the Confederates gave them these barrels so that they could use Confederate pistol bullet molds to make their ammunition. Of course, back then you melted your own lead and cast your own bullets. And this is my grandfather's gun, and I, being the eldest grandchild in the family, inherited it when he passed. So that's my prop, this old gun. It's all beat up. My great-grandfather was a shoemaker, so several of the pieces of this rifle are held on by shoemaker's tacks. It's seen better days. He and my grandmother did a lot for me in childhood. The happiest days of my life were out in the hills with them, going for a walk about this time of the day, about dusk, with him, and him calling to the owls and them talking back, and him whistling with that sort of, he could whistle like a steamboat. That was fun too. He was a good guy. There had been a number of old settlers, they were called, who had preceded the actual Trail of Tears. The actual trail happened mostly in 1838. About 17,000 Cherokees left Georgia and the Carolinas, and where they were, their ancestral lands, in forced marches. The soldiers would show up, and they'd have a few minutes to gather everything they had and be taken to concentration camps, where they were held together in horrible conditions until the military was ready to move them to Oklahoma. Some of the accounts written about that time by the soldiers themselves are just horrible. I can't read them. I tried to read one last night. I couldn't. It's awful what was perpetrated in this country. And although I went to school from kindergarten through postgraduate classes in college on the same campus, the old Cherokee Female Seminary, which was the first college west of the Mississippi, first American college west of the Mississippi. The Trail of Tears got about 15 minutes in 8th grade American history or Oklahoma history, and about that much. I graduated with a history minor. It was almost not mentioned. The Civil War in Oklahoma was hardly mentioned. We didn't think it had happened there, and now I find that 30% of the Cherokees who had survived the Trail of Tears and survived the early days in Oklahoma died during the Civil War. That was the highest death rate of any ethnic group in the country. Oklahoma, eastern Oklahoma, in those days between the removal between 1838-39 and the Civil War was just really no man's land. Lots and lots of killing. And then when the war came in, some Cherokees were slaveholders and sided with the South. Some sided with the North. So there was that. And then there was starvation and disease and the things that happen to people who have nothing to live on. They left with Samuel Worcester in 1834 before the actual Trail of Tears. I don't know how they avoided going with the large group on the trail. I don't know. There were this is another aspect of being Cherokee. Generally, your blood is traced from one person, but everybody. I grew up thinking everybody was part Cherokee. I mean, I remember finding out I had a friend who didn't have any Cherokee blood, and I thought, what the hell's wrong with him? And I kind of felt sorry. I mean, I thought everybody was. After the Civil War, because some Cherokees had sided with the South, that's all the government needed. They said, okay, the whole deal's off, no more reservation. There is no Cherokee reservation in Oklahoma. The land was parceled up and divided up, and people who could prove their membership in the tribe were given a parcel of land. But to qualify for that, you had to be in Oklahoma, resident, and sign up in the roll in, I think it was 1886, and then again in 1906. And if you happen to have settled in Arkansas or Texas or have moved out by then somewhere, you were ineligible. And that's one reason why there are a number of people who are obviously full-bloods or close to it who are not official Cherokees. There were several Dawes rolls, yeah. And there is a group here in town, the Mount Hood Cherokees, who have copies of the Dawes rolls, which they're pretty entertaining, yeah. Well, yeah, it was very complex, and I think much of American history exists in people's heads because John Wayne happened to star in a movie about it. He didn't do any movies about the Cherokee War, so who knows?